404. So we can get started. Yeah, welcome everyone to Broadening Ideas of Climate Justice, the Prison Industrial Complex and Climate Justice. This is a part of Stop the Money Pipeline's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion team's 4-part series. Yeah, I'm really excited to have worked on this with Aki from Positive Money and our Anima from Earth Guardians. Again, yeah, we're just really excited to have everyone here. We think it's going to be a really great discussion, and hopefully y'all see it the same way. So Austin, you can go to the next slide. So yeah, like I mentioned, this is part 3 of 4 parts. In August, we had a session on sacrifice zones and the era of electrification. Last month was a really great discussion on migrant justice and climate justice. Obviously, you found yourself here tonight to hear about prison industrial complex and climate justice. And then the series will be ending next month with a conversation on labor justice and climate justice. If you're interested in, just staying up to date with Stomp Jedi stuff or attending the last session, there is an RSVP link down there at the bottom. It is stmp.link/CJ2023. Again, just go there. You don't want to miss the sessions. They've all been great. And yeah, Austin, you can go to the next slide. So just to introduce myself and welcome everyone, my name is Karina Williams. I am a climate campaigner with Public Citizen. I use she, they pronouns, and I am based in Tongaland in California. The chat feature is open to everyone, so this would be a great moment to introduce yourself. Yeah, welcome if you feel called to share like your name, any org you're a part of, where you're at. You can find more about the land that you occupy in the history at the link that our Anima just dropped in the chat, native/land.ca. Yeah, we are excited to see who's in the room, see who's here, where are folks calling in from. Just give a minute for you to introduce yourselves. Already saw Alec did. Grace, nice to see y'all. And yeah, as you're introducing yourself, we can go to the next slide. So just a little rundown on how the evening's going to go. First, I'm just going to go over some Zoom logistics to make sure that everyone here can get the most out of this space and the most out of this conversation. Then we are going to ground the conversation, give some little explainers on the prison industrial complex, like why we're here. So if this is a completely new topic to you, don't worry. We are going to go over that a bit. Then I will introduce our moderator and panelists, and we'll get into really the bulk of the evening, which is a panel discussion on this topic. After some more planned questions, then we will go into Q&A from the audience. So again, please use the Q&A function, use the chat function. We really want to answer the questions that y'all have and make sure that you are getting the most out of this conversation. And then finally, we'll move to close. You'll see my face again. I'll tell you to attend the final session again, send thank yous and all of that. So yeah, next slide. Again, just some Zoom logistics. Please use the chat. Show your appreciation for the panelists, for the moderators. I think you can do heart reacts. You can do the little clap. Feel free to put some pluses in the chat. That being said, please keep the commentary respectful and relevant to the conversation. We are not afraid to delete your message. We're not afraid to boot you. Sometimes inclusive spaces are a little exclusive. So yeah, just keep that in mind. We do want to see the love, things you have questions for, but keep it respectful. And the thing, closed captioning is available. If you look at the bottom of your screen or wherever your Zoom toolbar is, there should be a little button with 2 C's for closed captioning. And from there, you can select to show subtitles. And yeah, if you miss anything, or if you want to go back and see this, you want to send this conversation to someone, we are recording the session. And so yeah, that will all be sent out in the next few days, the recording of it, as well as additional resources or any links that we mention in this conversation. They will get to you. Don't worry. And yeah, next slide, Austin. So just again, for folks who might not know who is Stop the Money Pipeline, or STOMP. STOMP is a coalition of over 200 organizations. We come together in this coalition primarily to hold financial institutions accountable for climate and environmental destruction, human rights abuses that we feel that they finance. And then within those organizations, there is the JEDI team, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, with representatives around the coalition who, care about making sure that this work is equitable, is diverse, and we get to host really cool things like this workshop series. Next slide. So yeah, we're here. Again, if prison justice, if climate justice is completely new to you, we hope that the next few slides kind of serve as an explainer for you to feel that you can enter the rest of the conversation from a place of knowledge and understanding. That being said, if you've never taught these topics, these next two slides are not going to give you everything you're going to learn. I would definitely say to seek other resources to continue learning, but hopefully just as we ground this conversation, folks feel that they learn something new or just understand the framework that we're coming from. So first, I'm just going to define the prison industrial complex, and this definition is taken from critical resistance, and to them, the prison industrial complex is the overlapping interests of government and industry that uses surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And why is that important in this space? That's because the prison industrial complex harms the same exact populations as environmental conditions do. The prison industrial complex disproportionately affects Brown, Black, Indigenous people, and poor folks. Just some stats that Black people are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. And Indigenous incarceration rates are 38% higher than the national average. So especially when we're having environmental conversations, it's important to note that this same system is replicating that harm that it is when we talk about environmental racism, or who is taking the burden of harms from climate change and who is being failed by government or industry. And within that, prisons are often built on uninhabitable toxic wastelands. A third of state and federal prisons are located within 3 miles of a Superfund site. If you don't know what a Superfund site is, that is a EPA designated site of serious contamination that requires extensive cleanup. They are places that they recommend folks do not live near, work by, or go to school at. So perfect place for a prison, I guess. And another unfortunate stat is that a 2022 research estimated that over half of US prisons and jails will be impacted by extreme heat, floods, and wildfires. And I'll go more into what that looks like. But something else too, so typically these sites are on former coal mines, will be on discontinued army bases. And there have been instances where if that land is rejected as a prison, they will then try to make it an ICE detention center. So again, if you were at the migrant justice event last month, this is also connected to it. This cycle of harm is continual. It impacts so many folks of various identities. And yeah, it's why we're here. It's why we think it's an important part of climate justice. Next slide. So some other facts is that the prison system often doesn't comply with health and safety regulations, leaving populations exposed to contaminated water, contaminated air, and many facilities are lacking air conditioning. Prisons and jails have really poor infrastructure. There's a lot of history of folks having poor water quality with heavy metals, or in cases where they are drinking bottled water that is rationed by the prison. They don't have access to that water regularly. And a big thing that's been popping up is that a lot of prisons and jails do not have air conditioning. And as climate change results in more extreme heat, folks are facing, triple digits inside these concrete and cement buildings. There have been some cases of folks incarcerated in Texas flooding their toilets so that the water goes on the floor and they can have something cool, which then actually makes them less likely to receive parole because it counts as a violation within the prison. Again, just continuing that cycle of folks, not having these needs met, being put in really inhumane conditions, and just being left to figure it out, which is a part of the next doc, that prisons often do not respond to climate emergencies and will abandon folks in times of climate crisis. We've seen this particularly with Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Ida are good examples where incarcerated people have been left in flooded facilities without electricity, without water. You'll see images of people trying to move sandbags to prevent the flooding. And then communication is also very limited in prisons. And so oftentimes folks are not able to even communicate with their outside loved ones, family, whoever, that they are safe. It is just this like black box of not knowing what's happening, of, yeah, no one evacuating, and are just kind of like figure it out. Um, as I mentioned, I'm from California, so I thought it was important to put in this one, but California relies very heavily on prison labor to fight fires. The latest number I saw from June of this year was that a third of wildland firefighters are incarcerated people. And within that, those folks are usually on the very front line of fires, trying to like clear cut vegetation, are like, yeah, at the very front of wildfires, which leads to lifelong health impacts. They are more likely to experience injuries on the job because they are at, yeah, that like frontline most like harmful part of fires. And they're also 8 times more likely to suffer injuries of smoke inhalation. And then within that, once folks are released, they are usually ineligible to become a professional firefighter because of their record. And yeah, again, it's just this cycle where folks are put into this harmful system. They are directly impacted by climate change. And then even if they are fighting climate change, like literally as firefighters, they can leave and are still left without support and without any care and yeah, like really any justice. We also feel that this conversation is super, super important given the increased criminalization of direct action and protests seen at Cop City, with water protectors being incarcerated, facing really escalated charges like domestic terrorism, and yeah, the criminalization of mutual aid, of like literally the word solidarity. And so like really as people who a lot of times are from these organizations who are, running direct actions or who are, trying to be in solidarity with frontline communities, we think that this is just a super important conversation as the state is using violence to criminalize a lot of these tactics. And also just want to end with a quote from ecofeminist and fashion writer Ryan Finn. She says, seeing people as disposable is antithetical to sustainability and ahistorical. For me, like her work just like sums it up clear. Like people are not disposable. People like this is a system that is harmful, that is completely antithetical to the climate movement. And yeah, it's why we think it's important. And so again, yeah, that was just a lot of information thrown out there. I don't expect you to be like an expert on any of this. Totally amazing if you still have questions. That's the point of the Q&A function. But yeah, after that, I think I'm going to pass it over now. Yeah, and so I'll just quickly introduce our moderator. We are so excited to have Isaiah Hernandez here. Isaiah is an environmental educator and founder of Queer Brown Vegan. Isaiah seeks to help everyone educate themselves on the intersectional nature of the climate crisis. Their work as a queer and brown environmentalist, they believe that a diversity of worldviews, backgrounds, and experiences are essential to achieve success in the environmental movement. We're so excited to have you here, and yeah, take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, everyone, for just being here today. I know that this topic is either new for some people or very knowledgeable in other sectors. Just a little bit about me is I got into environmental media work through environmental justice as someone who grew up in an EJ community here in LA, and really hitting the route through the migration lens and immigration lens was my introduction to actually learning about the intersections between the border and surveillance industry and also the prison and immigration industrial complexes, and how that's really essential for climate justice. So I'm super appreciative to be here today. And I kind of want to just get off started with each of our panelists that are here today, whoever wants to go first, but maybe if you want to introduce yourself, where you're calling in from, and also where you see the intersections between prison and climate justice showing up in your work. I think that for a lot of people, when we think about environmental work and the dominant structure and the dominant movements, we either think that we're just advocating for polar bears in the Arctic, which is of course valid, but we also need to understand the human component that comes from these conversations. So would love for each and every one of you to introduce yourself. Maybe we'll start off with Stefan, since I see you first on the screen on that end. Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Stefan Coward. I am on Kickapoo land. It's also known as Arlington, Texas, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. I am the Director of Economic Justice for the Hip Hop Caucus, and I've been working in the banking industry for the last about 20 years, and more specifically in the last 7 years, I have been doing a lot of financial advocacy work and financial activism, explicitly focusing on uplifting communities who have been worse and first impacted by injustice. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys, and I can't wait to share what I think the intersection is.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And Nikita will go next to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Nikita Oliver, I use they, them pronouns. I am currently on Kickapoo, Miami, and Kaskaskia land, also known as Indiana, and spend a great deal of my time in the Duwamish Coastal Salish territory. So really excited to be in space with y'all. A lot of my work is very much around abolition of prisons and police. And because, as Audre Lorde said, we don't live single issue lives, so there's no single issue struggle. Reality is that environmental and climate justice are intersecting issues. The same communities that are being deeply impacted by state-sanctioned violence, by police brutality, by the prison industrial complex, by the carceral death machine are also the same communities that are frontline on the climate crisis, the same communities that are experiencing extractive economies and exploitive economies because of racialized capitalism. And so, through my journey of organizing and activism, have began to see climate justice and environmental justice as inextricably interconnected to my work as an abolitionist. And one of the first ways I started engaging in that work more deeply was through No Doppel, partnering with folks like Matt Rimley and Rachel Heaton in the Seattle Pacific Northwest area around getting community to divest from banks that has been invested in pipelines and tar sands. Those are literally the same banks and investors that invest in Securus or prisons or other types of prison industries. And so bottom line is we're stronger together, and having alignment of our movements and our work, talking about the different ways each of us are organizing, being in relationship, is just going to make it more possible that we get to a world beyond prisons and police, that we get to a world with environmental justice, that we get to a world where we put people and planet above profit and power.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Nikita. I really appreciated all those honest truths that were being said today. So many snaps to that. And I want to go with May and then Big to introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you all hear me okay? Is the sound quality okay?
Perfect.
Okay, cool. My name is May. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful and excited to be part of this conversation. You can use any pronouns to refer to me, and I'm calling from occupied Chochenyo Ohlone territory in so-called Oakland, California. I'm originally from occupied Coast Salish Duwamish territories. And a lot of what I was going to say has already been said beautifully by the other panelists and by Karina. So I just want to echo everything that's been said. And yeah, I think one part to add is the relationship between settler colonialism and capitalism, and how they both rely on extractive industries, whether that's the extraction of human labor or the extraction of so-called natural resources. And so I think that there's a lot of overlap there, and it's really at the root of like both of these issues. I also want to extend acknowledgement and solidarity to the Palestinian people right now, and really underscore that this is an international struggle. The struggle for abolition doesn't stop on Turtle Island, even though we have a very specific history here of slavery and colonization here. I just want to underscore that incarcerated people throughout the third world, throughout the whole world, are experiencing these effects, oftentimes to like much greater degree due to lack of resources there. So there are thousands of Palestinians incarcerated in military prisons in Israel right now who, are fighting for their land and decolonization. And that's also part of the climate justice fight as well. Like I want to really separate, really like stop this separation of like environment versus people, because it was never separate in the first place. And like that itself is a colonial context. So we need to really shift paradigms and understand ourselves as part of the land. And so when we're doing that work, of course, we need to free people, you know? So I'll end it there for now and pass it on to Big.
Hello, I'm right now coming out of the Suquamish, Duwamish territories, and I'm big, part of my toxic prisons as well. I think one of the fundamental things I just want to add, because people said a lot of already what I would have said, is that people who, for example, are incarcerated are part of the environment that is being abused and used to extract resources and labor. And a lot of us come from completely marginalized communities, but not just that, but communities that are on the front lines of the environmental crisis that we're dealing with right now. On top of that, the prison industrial complex being a part of a source of labor for the military industrial complex was one of the biggest polluters across the globe. And I think I wanted to raise that into people's consciousness. And that's really all I got to say. So.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing those honest truths, and also recognizing that reweaving the narratives also means advocate for liberation, not just from a local level, but from international solidarity. One of the things that we kind of to get started is that when we think about the dominant, right, the popularized environmental and climate movement, there's often issues of this idea of like these movements and these organizations, or what we say big green NGOs, have often failed to really protect, first of all, Black, Indigenous people of color in those organizations, but also to ensure that there's an advancement of these dialogues that are happening. And I think that from many frontline organizers and environmental racist justice organizations, they've all said that the language around environmental justice, or even to talk about more quote unquote radical language, is now being co-opted and being used now in their own marketing strategies. And I kind of wanted to talk about, how do you think that we can really strengthen our own communities to ensure that when we're talking about environmental justice, that we're also advocating for those who are imprisoned, not just from the United States, from a global level, because I think a lot of people sometimes have issues around this idea of, well, not all people need to be liberated, when we know that that liberation is not so much extensive to what they're trying to talk about, or it's very limited / narrow-minded on that end. So for anyone who wants to answer that, whether you want to share about the issues with the dominant environmental movement, or how do we build stronger networks in that case?
I can kick it off and kind of start it back by answering the question that, that we have presented at the top, right? I believe that a lot of this is rooted in education, right? We creating easily digestible content so people can make more informed decisions, for them to be able to understand what is going on, because the stats are like the United States incarcerates more than any other people in the nation, right? Like there's literally probably about 2 million people who are incarcerated. And what I'd like to also say is that when we think of this movement work and like how they intersect, right? The prison divestment movement, I guess you would say, is like, I've seen it being very decentralized and hyper local. And in my opinion, I feel like in the last few years, we're starting to see it more organized, like on a national level, like a more on a collaborative basis, like the environmental and climate justice movement. And I really feel as if like prison divestment intersection with my work in economic justice is important, because we have to incentivize the reactive approach to confinement and focus on proactively how do we engage in economic empowerment and empowering our local communities as an organizer. Like, because if we think about it, it's like poverty is not only a predictor of incarceration, it's usually the outcome. And many people who with criminal records who like spend time behind bars, they can disrupt a person's life, create debt, limit housing, limit job opportunities, and destroy wealth. And like what usually happens there is that like you have these like community corporations who then start to devalue the community's that we live in, right? They devalue them from an economic, social, and environmental standpoint. And we know that what happens in the past is like when there's a natural disaster, we've seen it, communities of color, white communities have experienced an increased amount of like resources to rebuild when it doesn't happen with the other communities. And when you have that devaluation, we have like it creates these different systems that entrap communities. Like when we're talking about redlining, communities of color are being concentrated in areas that have been considered industrial zones next to highways, exposing them to harmful emissions. And if we're getting down deeper into it, it's like, many Black and Indigenous people like are more exposed to pollution than any other group, and more susceptible to more immune systems, like compromised immune systems. And so what I want everybody to really know is that, I say all that to say is that I want everybody to understand that economic justice, racial justice, gender justice, climate and environmental justice, they're all intrinsically linked, and that that there's an opportunity for us to be able to build there.
Absolutely. And I think those are the things that we're often not so much highlighted in our own educational systems. I mean, a lot of us can agree that collectively growing up, myself here in California, it's like you learn about prisons, you learn about immigration, you learn about environment, but then you think about, well, what are the building blocks that ensure that there is this interconnected web of knowledge that is being passed through of like, I didn't know that when people are released from prison, that their health is degraded, and that's due to their environmental conditions. And those are things that like those conversations are not brought to front light on that end. So I think it is important, like you said, the educational component on that end. I wanted to just give it to the room to anyone who wanted to also add into the question that I asked.
This question makes me think a lot about the politics of disposability. Whether we're thinking about currently incarcerated loved ones or communities inflicted with the state violence of poverty, or communities that have highways that go through them or flight paths over them. There is a treating poor people as if poor folks are disposable. And that is a political choice. It is a moral choice. And it is very much a part of the way that racialized capitalism has been constructed as an extractive and exploitative economic model. I think the reality is that when we think about climate justice, it is a call to end environmental racism. And whether we're talking about pollution in our communities or police violence, one of the things Ingrid Parody says is you can hear the refrain, "I can't breathe," in both of those. And so really, I think a big part of like the grip on our communities and why people don't always bring these things together is the economic system that is purposely set up to keep a group of poor people that most of society views as disposable. And so I do think there's a deep needing of like reinvestigating our humanity. I also think climate justice calls us to question sustainability and reimagine what does resiliency look like. And I feel like in our day and age, we're very invested in technological solutions being that response rather than going back to our ancestral technologies and becoming rooted in the land, which is a big reason why I was born and raised in Indiana, and why I've kind of made my way back to the Midwest is like, this is a place where there are still a lot of farmers. There's still a lot of people connected to the land, and yet at the same time, deeply impacted by racial capitalism. When you think about places in Washington where prisons are built, many of them are places where the earth was pillaged for lumber. And when that industry died, they replaced that industry with the prison industry. And the economic hold on people becomes a big reason why they are coerced into giving into this system. I think it's also just like holding that poverty itself is violent, poverty, incarceration, the health issues that come with it, environmental justice are like, they're cyclical and they're generational. And it is a type of state sanctioned violence that I think we've just come to accept as a society. And so I agree that part of it is education. I also think part of it is like asking those deeper questions of all of ourselves about what can I do without, and what ancestral technologies am I missing? Because when you're so disconnected from the land, it is very hard to value it. And if you can't value the land, you're not going to be able to value other people. And really finding ways to heal those relationships. And I don't mean for it to sound like all kind of like, well, we all come together and hug. I actually think it is much more disruptive than that. It is literally being willing to disrupt our typical patterns and ways of being for something better. And so I think a big question that I ask myself, and I'm not going to pretend like I have an answer, is like, what am I willing to let go of in order to be able to regain my own connection to land and community?
I really appreciate those words of truthfulness and also wisdom, because I think that a lot of people often shame themselves to the point where it's like they can't see a solution other than these technocratic solutions that are being talked about in the climate space. Yet those questions should actually be, an investment should be reinvested in the ways that we are processing our trauma, the ways that we interact with people, the ways of recognizing, even interrogating, like, and I'm speaking on my behalf of my own, like my own colonial thoughts that I've been indoctrinated to, the own types of thoughts and ideologies that made me think, oh, people like that are in prison don't deserve freedom because they did something bad. Those are things that, the assumptions that I need to interrogate. And I think our community members often forget about, the ways in which our system has reproduced poverty and criminalized so many people for so many low-level offenses that were stricken and accelerated due to poverty and not having access to resources to nourish their soul. So I really like this reinvestment of community and recognizing that what we're giving up is actually a reinvestment to ourselves and a respect to the land, because that's the thing that we want to continue building on that end. And I kind of wanted to give to May and Big to kind of share their words on that end.
I guess I could go first. So I'd actually also add on, like, on top of that, and think about environmental material reality, right? Because not just symbolic. I see a lot of times when we see some environmental movement, and it tends to be symbolic, when I think we need to be focused on material realities, material outcomes as well. Specifically when we see how people are pillaged from our communities and put into incarcerated spaces, we see, like, for example, federal facilities being built on like toxic land, specifically, like all of them. You know what I mean? And when we see like material realities of like when who faces the outcomes of the environmental blowback that we're facing right now, it's going to be people who are on the margins already, the communities that are already being forsaken by capitalism, right? Seen as sacrificial spaces to give away to the disaster that capitalism has brought, as well as, like, the people who are incarcerated. When we talk about like disasters, whether it's talking about what happens when disasters hit a prison, or when we're talking about putting people on the front lines, it's like I was talking about a little bit earlier, to fight fires for people, but not seeing the humanity of the folks that have been extracted from their community to do so, and also not seeing the value of those communities they're extracted from. And I think that's where kind of environmentalism can fall short a lot of times in my experiences, because people don't see the material need and make material impacts instead of seeing symbolic impacts. And I think if we put material impacts first, people's material safety, people's the environment's material safety as well, then I think we can really make a big difference. But if we don't start there, then I think we're kind of going to be on the wrong road.
Absolutely. This value of ecological wealth that is rooted in those lived experiences and those individuals, and people not being able to see the fact that, like, how do you value a tree, an animal, but you don't value a Black and Indigenous person of color that is thrown into the depths of poverty, and yet our humanity is disconnected from that. And the more need to push for those narratives, and also the material relationships that are being constructed from these movements needs to evolve from that. So thank you. I think May is up next.
Thank you. Yeah, what you just said reminded me of something that was said by an incarcerated comrade named Kinetic Justice, also known as Robert Earl Council. He's one of the founders of the Free Alabama movement. And when he spoke at one of our convergences a few years ago now, he said something along the lines of, like, where's the animal liberation front people at? Like, they're freeing animals from cages, like they have those skills, you know, and the will to break into institutions and free creatures from cages, but that energy is not like applying to people. And so that was just like, yeah, some framing that he offered that what you just said reminded me of. So I wanted to share that. Again, I really resonate a lot with what's been said so far around disposability. And I think that I want to just offer some framing that may be useful, that I think gets left out of these conversations a lot, which is that the disposability, the extraction, the sacrificing, like all of this is not on accident. It's not a mistake that's being made by the prison system. I think a lot of times reformists will frame things as though, oh, it's a failing, like how can the system is broken, things like this. But like all of this is very intentional. And I think that we need to look at it all through that lens when it comes to the intersections with climate justice and abolition. Because, for example, when Karina said at the beginning about like the struggle for getting air conditioning in institutions, especially in Texas, and how people are, you know, really exposed to much higher temperatures than the free world because they're in these unventilated concrete structures. And so it's like, yes, we need air conditioning. People obviously need access to livable temperature. However, we're also seeing in California that air conditioning is being weaponized against people. It's being turned on like way higher than it needs to be. People are like cold, they're having their blankets taken away from them in the summertime. The AC is blasting, it's making people sick. And then also we've seen in other areas in the South where they don't have AC, however, the pigs will still use temperature to punish people. So it's not just neglect. It's not just, oh no, they don't have AC, people are being forgotten and neglected. It's like, no, actually this is being weaponized. And so, you know, we have comrades on the inside who've been forced to put on all their clothes in the summertime when it's 110 degrees and they're inside an unventilated concrete box. And they're going to get written up with a DR if they, you know, wear a short sleeve and like shorts. That was definitely something that came up. Also, having seen pigs, the COs turn on, prison administration turn on the heat in the middle of the summer as punishment, you know? We don't hear about those things when it comes to climate justice. And I think that it's really important because whatever changes that we're trying to make will be reabsorbed and co-opted by these institutions if we're not proactive about it. So I just wanted to share that a little bit, just to add framing to what's been said already.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things that takeaways from this is like this idea of like how abolition plays a huge role in actually advocating for true justice, because to say that a system is broken and to say that we need to fix it is to continue upholding that same status quo that was designing us to continue to imprison people. And I really like this because I remember even myself when I was in college being challenged to this idea of like, do I actually think the system is broken? Or do I think that it needs to be uprooted for what it stands for on its foundation, that it continues to perpetuate racial capitalism, that it continues to perpetuate slavery in these institutions? So I just really appreciate that reframe on that end. And you know, to tie it back to like, you know, the prison divestment movement, I kind of want to ask this question to Stefan, is that, you know, we talked a lot about the importance of education to be able to understand, you know, to empower our communities and to continue to move that dial from our conversations from just like younger generations, but to our elder generations who have been doing this work. But I wanted to learn more about the history around the prison divestment movement, because I think one of the things that we see today with our movements is that sometimes younger generations can sometimes, not say everyone, but some don't recognize that the resistance and movements have always existed for decades. And there's so many elders who have been literally on the forefront that are still alive today that have been able to organize successfully and know how to survive these systems. And I often think that that's something where it's really key and critical of like, yes, we need accessible information, but we also need that extensive information of histories to ensure that like what we're learning is actually what it's going, that is literally being repeated of what we're seeing today.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that because that's something really important to me. And I'll just say for my own journey, like coming into this space, is that I've seen the fight being taken like, you know, very hyper local and like going straight to the source, like outside of the community. And Like I mentioned earlier, I feel like it had been decentralized in a little space, right? And I feel like now there's an opportunity with the access to additional information, with access to technology, for us to be able to coordinate on a larger scale. And I'm seeing so many more people get into this fight and find ways that where we can share, information, especially learning from the best practices of the climate movement already. There's one of the things that really sticks out to me is I am appreciating seeing how people are using the power of economic boycotts, economic shareholder power, like the different levers of financial power, to be able to advocate for change, hitting them in the pockets, because you're absolutely correct. This system is working the exact way it was designed. And the way to be able to hold them accountable is to cut the money source, right? Like, like having detailed campaigns about, like, we're thinking about Cop City, right? We don't have to look no further than that to see the intersection, but the ability to apply pressure to the different corporations, because there's like over 4,000 corporations who are uplifting and profiting off of this prison industrial system, and that us being able to utilize data and technology in a way to be able to be more targeted in our approach has been incredible, for me to see how we're using it, right? Because I didn't want to minimize it by saying, oh, it's just education, right? We know the facts, but I think it is using database storytelling, this narrative work, to be able to communicate how we, like, how far we've come, the progress, the progress that we've made, but how much further we must go, and how much deeper we must dive into this. So it's like I'm appreciative of us using the financial levers of power and technology to be able to have to get the change that we want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this like idea that you were saying, like, draining the oppressor from its resources, and recognizing that for so long, I think that people have defended these non-human logo entities that are forms of colonialism, forms of white supremacy, yet what is often not recognized is the power of that community people, of like what we stand for is that we don't follow the institutions. They are trying to follow us, and we're going to drown them in case they are trying to use us to as any types of oppression of structures that they want to continue upholding. And I think, like you said, yeah, it's not just education history, but also like this idea of like database storytelling is what's going to drive people from that financial side, or even people that have that economic justice and power for themselves, to be like, you know what, you are right, I can do something. And I think that's where those conversations are like beginning to not just flourish, but they're spreading across multi-generations, to know that there is that power on that end. And I think, with that being said, on the idea of like using history and education, I kind of wanted to go to Nikita, because you do a lot of amazing work with law, arts, and education and community organizing. And I think one of the things that a lot of people often, feel disconnected is that within our movements, whether that's racial, social, environmental justice movements, even though they're all one, there are people that are outside of those movements that can say, I acknowledge that I am for LGBTQ communities, I am for BLM, but their idea and stances around liberation is just stating stating the statement that's been put out there, but yet the actions are not being done. And I think that one of the things I kind of want to talk about is the role of intersectionality. Is that I think intersectionality today has been almost diluted and co-opted from many, I would say, like liberal movements, of just saying intersectionality is working with a corporation that imprisons people, and now we have LGBT people as the face of diversity, and that's not what it is. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, like, what intersectionality plays a role within abolition and climate justice.
Yeah, thanks for that. That makes me think about something May said earlier that I think ties into this, about when they were telling the story about having air conditioning, but the air conditioning being weaponized. I think a place where environmental justice movements and abolitionist movements could better intersect is at the place of understanding some of this stuff we can't fix. Like, we can't fix prisons. Nothing that we do to try to make prisons nicer or friendlier or feel more welcoming eliminates the trauma, the punitive nature, the coercion, the way in which prisons literally exist just to punish people. There's absolutely nothing healing about the carceral death machine. There's nothing healing about the court process. And so it doesn't do what it purports to do. Like, we've all been lied to. We've all been told that prisons, police, and prosecution make us safer. In reality, they absolutely don't. In fact, they probably make us all less safe. And so that pointing out how the air conditioning itself was weaponized against folks inside, that is the behavior of prisons. It will always be the behavior of prisons, to punish people, to coerce people, to control people, to oppress people, to treat people as objects of property, right? So abolition is the only way. Some of this stuff we can't greenwash. And so I think that is where environmental justice and climate justice, sometimes in the mainstream, really misses the intersection with abolitionist movements. Is like, some stuff won't be fixed. We actually have to get rid of it, and we have to start over if we're going to get to the world that we want to live in. And so, intersectionality is like, the academic thing came from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And its real point is that earlier quote that I gave, which is that people don't live single issue lives. Like, the struggle is not single issue. And so if our movements are not intersecting, we are inevitably going to miss someone, right? And that example you just gave of LGBTQ folks, queer folks, trans folks being used as poster childs for oppressive systems, I understand that often as coercion. People make choices to survive. They're maybe not the choices I agree with, but at the end of the day, it is this coercive system that pushes people to make that choice, right? And so some of this, like, I would keep saying it, some of it we just can't fix. And it comes down to being willing to let go of the need to have the answer about what comes next. As an abolitionist, the question I'm always getting asked is, well, what do we do with the murderers and the rapists? And reality is, there's a few realities there. One, most people who commit murder and rape are not in jail. They're not, right? So jails are not preventative, they're reactionary. Jails are also used to create a class of people that don't have access, do not have choices, do not have freedom or liberation. And it's very intentional. What May was saying about how intentional the violence of the system is, whether it's the extraction or the disaster capitalism or the purposefully doing certain things in certain spaces to make profit and control, it is intentional. And so remembering that when it comes to having the answer of what's next, it is actually unfair to ask oppressed peoples, Black and Indigenous peoples, queer and trans peoples, poor peoples, disabled peoples, folks who have been dealing with this crisis for forever, to suddenly be able to pop up and have an answer that we've never had the resources to fully develop. So what I encourage people to do is experiment and explore. We don't have all the answers. The answer we do have, though, right now is that the current system isn't working. 2.3 million people are incarcerated in jails, even more in immigrant detention centers, even more in other carceral systems like mental health facilities that they're coerced into. And we know that that doesn't make us safer. So we have to go on the facts. If the United States here on Turtle Island was going to be safe based on our current way of thinking, we would be the safest place in the world because we incarcerate more people than any other nation, but we're not. And so with that one fact, if we really get to the point where as abolitionists, as environmental and climate justice liberators, our goal is how do we create the safest, healthiest communities possible? We're not doing that right now. In fact, our entire system is reactionary and exploitative. So why are we so unwilling to give it a chance to get rid of these things that are not working for us and at least explore and experiment and build things that can? And remembering that those solutions may not be one size fits all. Our current carceral system purports to be one size fits all, and it doesn't work. So can we have nuance and opportunity to apply different solutions and responses to be able to respond to the unique crises while simultaneously being connected enough that we can share information, we can share ideas, we can build upon things that are happening in other places, and that we can share resources. So I guess the big thing I would push people to do is, like, where is your radical imagination to actually imagine a world where we can all be as safe and healthy and resilient and sustainable as possible? And I do not think that is an impossibility. Do I think that it means there won't still be harm or natural disasters? No, those things will still occur. But what I do know What I do know is that the possibility of doing better always exists. And it does require abolition. It does require connectedness. It does require seeing a new value in each other and the land. And we're going to have to be willing to try some things that we haven't tried before in an effort to find what really does get us to that place that we want to live in. And it will mean pushing back against these oppressive systems. And that is not always going to be peaceful. These systems are not peaceful. These systems enact violence on people daily. And so resistance is inevitable. And we have to get comfortable with the different ways in which different people and different bodies with different experiences, experiencing different types of oppressions, have to push back against that system.
Everything snaps to that, because I think, the common question, and my friends who are abolitionists, they say, what is the common thing they get? And it's usually the murderers questions. And I think that's one thing. It's like to just pull out a factoid on this of what you were saying. It's like around 1 million plus in the United States are literally imprisoned for low level crimes. So whether that was like tickets or like violations, or even just like marijuana use, like just for having it. And like those are things where we're talking about the fact that the United States is one of the largest police states in the world, where it imprisons and continues to plunder those communities. And I think one of the things that I really love that you were saying is that it's not a one type solution thing. And how is it the fact that it's easier for people to imagine the end of the world than actually trying to reimagine a radical future where it's all of us together, while acknowledging those messy contradictions that as humans we live in. And I think this is kind of like second to your question to you, is like to kind of talk more about this idea of like, what are some of the ways that we can actually support each other in the fights against the systems of oppressions, understanding that, yes, we need different movements to come together and coalitions to understand each other. But I think one of the questions too within the audience that I saw is kind of like, how do we take care of ourselves and take care of each other? Because I think a lot of frontline organizers often really have this not even idea, but like it sometimes can be sacrificial, where it's like they give them so much to the movement, and then they burn out. And they have, obviously, burnout leads to chronic health conditions. It leads to other like systems of poverty that push them to that edge. So how do we make sure that we can adopt those helpful and also equitable strategies in our movements?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I try to be really honest with this question, that I actually don't have the answer to this. I feel like I have burnt myself out time and time again. And some of it is because the need feels so urgent. And I do think there's the places where white supremacy drives urgency that we have to be cognizant of and not give into. And then there are the spaces where there is very real urgent needs happening, and urgent responses and ways to show up. I think where I'm leaning in my life now is about intention and strategy. Where am I putting my energy that is pushing towards that radical future that you were talking about, and trying to figure out how to put my energy there. And I don't have a perfect answer for it. I think the reality is, especially as Black and brown people, as queer people, as trans folks, our daily lives are dealing with oppression and struggle, right? Getting up every day and just going out into the world is an affront to white supremacy and patriarchy. And then at the same time, we're tasked with trying to figure out how to, in a balanced, healthy way, organize against the oppressor. Like it is a weighty question. And what I encourage folks to do is like, do what you need to do for you. There is no expectation that you throw yourself on the line as the sacrificial lamb for all of humanity to get it right. None of us are Jesus or any other prophet, that people call out to. And taking care of ourselves is okay. I had a period of time the last 2 years when my heart rate was like very high, and my doctor was like, you're going to have to take medication. And I had to make choices about, are there spaces that I need to pull out of? What is my role in this work right now, and how do I do that well? And I also just want to highlight, for those of us who don't have families, don't have children, maybe don't have visible folks we're caring for, or people don't know who we're caring for, it is often so hard for us to step back from spaces. People think that because you don't have people in your home that they know you're caring for, that you don't have reasons to be tired. And I would say as organizers, as community, we need to give each other grace and compassion. We need to try to organize at a pace that is responsive to the struggles each of us are experiencing. And we should find ways amongst ourselves, even if it's just 5 of us or 10 of us, figuring out what our mutual aid looks like within us. How are we caring for each other? And sometimes that does mean taking space or finding other ways. And it doesn't always have to be about what are we tearing down. Sometimes it should be about what are we building. And I find most of my joy actually in the spaces where I am building things with other community members, other organizers, that is more emblematic of that radical future that I want to live in.
You know, yeah, like you were saying, like choosing to love is an act of humility, but also the fact of like how we treat ourselves is how other movements are going to be treated, and the long-term sustainability of that. And I really love the you said about the Jesus thing, 'cause it's like we don't need more symbols in the movement. We need more actions. We need more collective ideologies coming together and theories of change to emerge from these types of grassroots networks and to actually provide us tangible solutions. And the thing is, like, you know, I feel like oftentimes there is this times of like, you know, people asking like who takes care of you, and it's like the answer is like I don't know who takes care of me, because we've been designed in a very individualistic society and system that has forced us to be in isolation, to say this is okay, this is how I should live, therefore this is how what I deserve. And I feel like that social conditioning over the years really programs the ways in which we show up in our work, and how we have to unlearn those behaviors too, while also trying to you know, manage other crises that come up from our lives and even from the movement, because that their community is a lifeline, so that's deeply interconnected to who we are as beings. So thank you so much just for that honest truth. For May and Big, you know, I know that we talked a lot about history to movements to even taking care of each other. You know, your organization specifically, the mission is to challenge the prison industrial complex and to build solidarity between historically marginalized and siloed movements. And one of the things that I see a lot with any movement building is that trust, right? Trust is not given, it's built. And one of those things is recognizing that there are communities that have every right to say, I don't want to work with certain individuals or certain people for certain reasons, but there's also a need to be able to understand each other. And so what are some of those hardships that you've all been through in your organizations, and how have you been able to build that trust, and also recognizing that theories of change are always going to be different?
I can go ahead and speak to this first. Can you all still hear me all right?
Yes, perfectly.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I just want to speak really briefly to the previous conversation about care. I think you really said at the end about how this is not like an individual issue. I just kind of want to echo that, because we cannot self-care our way out of this shit. Like, we just can't. It's not possible. Like, it's a scam. It's all about community care and mutual aid, and like that's really how we're going to survive through all of this, and how we have survived until this point. So I kind of just want to like re-highlight that before moving on. When it comes to trust building between like environmental justice or even climate justice, and even just environmental movements and prison abolition, like, yes, tons of reason for distrust. And I think that trust is earned like through experience. And so I would say one example that I would like to share of trust building is between these movements is around like collaborating on direct actions. I think that that's like one space that I've found that has really allowed for a lot of real trust building, because by planning a direct action and really being clear on like, who are the targets, why are we doing this, what are people putting on the line to do this, what is the risk, all of those things, I think requires like a certain level of like prior relationship building. And I think that it really, like planning and executing a direct action with people from environmental and prison abolition movements has been like a huge source of trust building for myself personally. I'm like, oh, like you all had like not very much context for abolition before this, but you threw down and shared your tactics and skills. And like now I know like where you're at and like what you're willing to do. And like there's learning that goes on both sides. And one of the reasons why I want to share this is because I think that there are a lot of resources in the environmental movement and a lot of skills and tactics that can be really useful to abolitionists. And I think they're being underutilized. And that's something that we try to do a lot, is like take those like, you know, like tripods, concrete barrels, lock boxes, you know, like these are things that eco defenders are very, you know, experienced and skilled with, but we don't see a lot of those tools being used in abolitionist direct actions. And so bringing those together can be really powerful and unexpected for our enemies. So for example, like a few years back, we helped organize a direct action that shut down Core Civic using tripods. And I think that there was a lot of just like learning and trust building and relationship building that happened throughout that process. And those bonds and networks, you know, we've been talking about also decentralization, because a lot of our work is very national. Like those bonds stay, like we know people in that town who threw down and like their communities. And like, I think that, yeah, taking risks together, putting shit on the line, and not everyone needs to be doing that. Often it is going to be like the white people who will encourage to take those risks and, you know, shoulder the like resource side of things, and really like kind of apply those skills to abolitionist direct actions. So that's one example that I wanted to share.
So, from my perspective, I wanted to touch on trust. I want to say specifically, I don't tend to view trust as an on-off switch, and I think a lot of us have been programmed to view it that way, like I either trust you or I don't, versus levels of trust. Like how much do I give this person? How much can I trust them with? And based off of experiences, right? Struggling together, and not when it was beneficial for them to be doing the best thing, but the things when nobody wants to be there, and seeing how people interact with each other, how people support each other, is a lot of what like informs me about how much I can trust people. I think bringing those type of levels where you can let people in bit by bit based off of interactions can really be what builds trust. Also, how do people hold you when times get hard, right? How do people hold your space when things go all to the left? And do they make space for you? I think one of the things of building trust, like within our organization, is showing support for each other and being able to check in with each other. For example, on are we over exerting ourselves? We put too much energy in, and like seeing where it is. If we know we're going through some traumatic stuff, checking in with each other and showing that love. And I think that builds trust foundationally, and that's extremely important. I did want to touch a little bit on the also on like one thing that I think we always got to keep in mind too, is like when we talk about organizing, especially without having the conversation of security culture, right? And I think there's a conversation we had recently that made me think of how trust doesn't mean you're in on everything and all information. And I think that having that open understanding helps keep trust coming and switching between each other, because just because we trust each other doesn't mean we have to be in the know about every single thing. And I think when we walk into those situations like that, then it also builds trust, because then it's not based off of people feeling insecure about knowing certain things or not knowing it, because you realize that trust has been being built the whole time. I did want to touch on some of the stuff that was said earlier too, if I can real quick, specifically around the idea of like, when we're talking about abolition and like, what about the rapists and murderers? That's like that big conversation that comes up. And I wanted to say one of the things when we talk about specifically murderers, the interesting thing about that, they're the least likely to reoffend. And when we see people, we got to understand that those type of situations are specifically context specific. And if we don't understand what was going on, we got to try to avoid judging those concepts and think that these people are just out here. Like, it's not a Batman movie, you know what I mean? It's not like some DC comic. It's real life, and people are way more complex. So a lot of the people, for example, even some of our comrades who are inside, have heavier charges like that, but they're some of the most solid people you would ever meet. And as far as the system and like rapists and sexual assault, they don't care. Like, the system doesn't put any care to that in the first place. We see that whether we talk about a rich person like Brock Turner, or the fact of story after story of people like me who, when I was incarcerated for drug crimes, went and sat and watched people who were child molesters walk away. So the system doesn't really invest in that. So when we get those questions as abolitionists, we kind of like, one of the things I like to do is point that out to people, because the system isn't here to protect our communities. It's our responsibility to make safe communities for each other, and think about the responsibility we have to each other.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of the tier system is actually something that I use in my own friendships, of like tiering my friendships when I meet them. The fact is that, you know, like there is different depths of levels of love that you have for a person. And that is a reciprocal relationship of actually, when having that trust, is like, what does that accountability even look like, right? Like saying I'm disappointed in you for a certain action does not mean that I no longer trust you. And I think those are the things where often now, I think with like younger generations today, like, you know, we feel like voicing those concerns almost is like, it's not, we should be reprimanded for that. We should actually be, you know, I value when friends tell me I hurt them, to be like, you know, the fact that you trust me enough to say that how I made you feel and how I hurt you, like, allows me to understand like what I need to do to make sure that I make a safer space for you, and I actually hold myself accountable to those actions. So I really like that. I know, Stefan, you unmuted yourself a bit. If you wanted to add on to what that they were saying, or what the previous statement that was said before.
I love what everybody's saying. Like, I just believe in ecosystem building, right? Like, sharing those tools between the network, and just I'm using the word educated only and saying, like, I want us to share knowledge amongst each other. Like this is what the best practices that worked for me. Maybe, your situation is case by case, but if there's an opportunity that you can benefit from any of these things, just sharing that information amongst each other, because leveraging technology and other tools to be able to help people. And that's why I feel like things have been so hyper, local or decentralized, because that wasn't always there in the place, but now it is. And now there's an opportunity for us to be able to arm our other community members, with the tools and resources so they can do what they need to do in their community.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really, I mean, this discussion has gone so much to this idea of like the human to human relationships that we hold. And what does that actually look like in the ways that we continue to kind of build stronger movements, but also to the fact that how much I really appreciate this conversation, how much it's been able to really challenge my mind, but also to challenge hopefully others in this, and the panelists and people that are watching this panel, to recognize this idea of like this large complex issue actually starts and begins a lot with our own relationships and how we choose to navigate the world. And those are things that are easily able to be shifted when we choose to actually challenge ourselves, to be both uncomfortable, but to be both in a state of wanting to learn and unlearn and relearn those types of structures. And so I kind of wanted to get into specifically the questions from the audience, because I know that we had definitely a lot of questions that just rolled in through the last few minutes on here. Nikita, you mentioned the lumber industry being replaced by prisons. Can you talk more about that and other examples that have been coming up on your end?
Yeah, there's a great book by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I'll try to drop it in the chat, but she does a lot of work breaking down how other exploitative and extractive industries have been replaced by prison industries. And the oldest form of that is literally what happened right after slavery, where the ending of quote unquote chattel slavery, the move into convict leasing. Literally, the prison system has constantly been in this state of reinventing itself or replacing itself in other places, right? And so I think that's where we have to have a really critical eye. We have to see not just the intersection of climate justice and environmental justice, but also economic justice, and the role that the economic system we live in plays in these things. California has had a number of types of industries that have caused serious environmental degradation, and then they literally just build a prison right on top of it as a way of replacing the industry in that space, and then also having a way to incarcerate more and more people. California has had one of the most rapidly growing carceral systems of any state on Turtle Island. And those are usually in places that were either toxic. I think May already said this, that they were either toxic or were some sort of industry like a lumber industry. And so there are some great books by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She really thinks a lot about geography and how prisons and geography intersect, but also how prisons and economics intersect, and then overlays environment on top of it. So I'd really recommend folks read those, and I'll try to drop the links in the chat for folks to be able to access.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. This is a question for all the panelists. We talked a lot about the role of being able to trust. And how do you think about the role of both solidarity and allyship, which is something that, those two things go hand in hand, in organizing coalitions across class? And to you, I guess, and to anyone that wants to answer, what does actually good land relations mean in the context of organizing? Obviously, we know that we have different ways of how we see it, but it is very important to be able to just learn from your perspectives on the end.
I would love to speak to this. First, again, I want to respond briefly to, or just add a little bit to what Nikita was saying about extractive industries being replaced with prisons. I want to just share an example. In Letcher County, Kentucky, which is a former coal mining site, they tried to build what would have been the most expensive federal prison in U.S. history. The Bureau of Prisons was going to build it on top of a former coal mining site next to a former an active coal slurry pond, and about like a couple miles from an old growth forest. And through solidarity between rural people from that town, environmental justice organizers, and abolitionists, and 21 plaintiffs who were incarcerated who filed a lawsuit, we were able to stop that. And so I just want to, share that story to say that this process of colonization and taking these degraded lands, disposing of people on them is intentional, but it's not inevitable. These are things that we can stop. Can you all still hear me? This is my internet connection.
Yes, Deb, hear you.
And then to respond to your question about the solidarity and allyship, I really do not care for allyship. I don't want allies. I don't need allies. I don't consider myself an ally in the movement. Look up accomplices, not allies, for a reframe on that. We need to think for ourselves and not, I think that allyship can be really problematic when it falls into kind of identity politic driven forms of people just picking someone based on whether it's race, class, gender, someone or an organization to align themselves with. And then I think it really can stop a lot of critical thinking and genuine relationship building of being able to be critical of each other and have genuine relationships. I think that to be an accomplice to someone, to be in the struggle with them and not just being oh, cool, you're struggling and I'm over here and I'm giving a thumbs up and I'm your accomplice, versus I'm in this with you. I'm putting my skin in the game with you because our liberation is connected and I'm not free until you're free. And so it's not about charity. It's not about helping other people because we wouldn't want that to happen to us. It's that we literally cannot be well until our people are well and free, And so I think it's really about that. And I really choose to reject allyship politics for that reason.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I'm adding all of these books that were just shared in resources because I think those are the conversations that should be happening, and how much we can learn so much from the intercollaboration of what you just said, Nikita, and also May. It's I didn't know about immigration camps literally being built on toxic sites in Miami, and then having to recognize the ones who hold power to be able to hold those industries accountable and to stop it are those local organizations that are on the ground on that come from different spaces. To be able to bring those on that end. And just the note of allyship, to really thank you on that reframe too of what is allyship, the idea of how that shows up even in our own interpersonal relationships, from just friend to friend aspects on that end. So I just really appreciate that. If anyone would like to add on to what was just said, feel free to unmute yourself and speak.
So I mean, I just want to like way I always viewed it as far as like I said, like May said, allyship is not really something, at least the way it's been held, that really is something I'm interested in. But solidarity to me is like having as much be as invested in my community's interest as you are in your own. You know what I mean? Like if you really are on like in camaraderie, I like that better. If you're a comrade, right, you're gonna be as invested in holding each other side by side, shoulder to shoulder. And for me, I gotta say, a lot of my introduction to politics happened when I was studying while incarcerated, right? And when we think about how people move incarcerated, there's things called cars, right? And so these different cars are groupings of people. Um, will have allies or people that are in like solidarity with them. And what happens if something goes down, people move together. And I want to see that level of strength because we as people are like super codependent upon each other, no matter how we want to chop it, right? We aren't in a bubble. We're not isolated on the moon somewhere. We're on a planet in the ecosystem, and these things affect each other. And so for people to have solidarity is to show up in action as if I'm your brother, right? If I'm your cousin or your sister, or, you know what I mean? That's how we move. And that's what I look for. And when I talk about working with people, though, on the other hand, it doesn't have to be the same level. It could be just having same material interests. But then I wouldn't consider him someone that's fully in solidarity with me, but we might be in solidarity on this project, right? Like, for example, there was a point where we had shut down 3 prisons in Alabama specifically, and some of the people that we actually have built were people who we generally would not have, right? There was even, ironically, and if people know me, they know I don't like the police. I don't like no swine. Like, I'm cool. But there was a point where we actually had built with the sheriffs even because they were just mad that this prison was being built based off of without their consent. Like they didn't come and check in with them. And as much as I think that's a ridiculous reason, yo, we're gonna take it. But they're not gonna have the same space as somebody I consider somebody who's a comrade, right? There's someone who has like a momentary allyship based off of that's when I see allyship being useful, right? A momentary allyship based off mutual interest. But I think there's a difference between that and people you can count on, like comrades, like the people in FTP, who are consistently going to show up together and for each other, no matter what happens. And I think we got to have those two distinctions too, as well, because sometimes we need to have coalitions with people that we might not want to share dinner with. You know what I mean? Because we're thinking about the betterment of our community first and foremost. Hopefully that added on in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, the transparency part is key. I mean, I think just like recognizing like who you are in solidarity with, / who are you specifically in alignment with in certain views and values to get what you need for your community and the greater good of your community on that end. And I think that's something that like shouldn't be seen as a hurtful thing, a divisive thing. It's just that's the end goal for that community or the collective group. And so I just really appreciate the honesty, because I think that's where I think sometimes people struggle with this idea of like, I have to be friends with them, or I have to share dinner with them, or I have to be in solidarity with them. But then it's like, you're not in solidarity. And that's the thing where people don't want to recognize on that end. So I know that we're wrapping up here, and I kind of wanted to close up with one of our closing questions for all the panelists here, because I think there's been such strong takeaways about the ways in that we talk about climate justice and prison-led movements that center abolition and the need for really reimagining this future. Is, a lot of people here today probably have extensive experience on these types of institutions or in different led movements that are trying to build even much more stronger coalitions and powers. Is that, how can the general individual get involved, and what actions can folks take moving forward from this specific panel on the incredible information you've all given us? Any organizations or any individuals that you'd like us to highlight or uplift in your own work, we'd love for you to just share anyone specifically that we can help support, and knowing the fact that everyone here out of this panel can help do something about that.
Excuse me. I love to start by sitting there saying I appreciate the fact that when we're having this conversation, is like all people may be working on something different, right? But it's like there are points to where we can come together to exert more pressure. And I think that of us finding more opportunities to do that is fantastic. Because I'll say, for example, and I know this I believe in, pushing on the financial levers of power to make them crack, and like, hitting them in the pocketbook and doing things like that. So like, because I believe in investing in the public health and safety of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, right? By getting the flow of capital into the community, so we can finance like reparative, climate friendly infrastructure projects, right? Like, I believe in trying to take a proactive approach to that. So I have a campaign to where at Hip Hop Caucus to where it's called Bank Black and Green, and it's a multi-year campaign to where we are getting impact investors to unlock that $4 trillion in capital that they have to invest in the regenerative economy, to be able to getting those impact investors to invest in Black-owned financial institutions, Black-owned banks who are taking the pledge to say that they will not finance fossil fuels or mass incarceration. And when we get them to invest in that, the goal is to use that as a campaign to say that if these smaller institutions with limited amount of resources and capital who are out here overperforming and serving, our communities can take this pledge, there's no reason why you larger financial institutions cannot do the same. Our goal is to raise the bar on climate finance campaigning, and then also just say that we're not in the business of trading one oppressor for the next, right? Like, we're not here for that. So our goal is we're just leveraging this economic system to be able to this one that needs to be completely dismantled and rebuild something else, but we're leveraging it to fight back. And if anybody's interested in the work that we're doing at Hip Hop Caucus, please, you can get in contact with us there.
Does Nikita, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I dropped a number of resources in the chat. Highly encourage folks to do your own reading or watching, get engaged in some, like, I don't know, build a study group with some of your friends. I think the more you learn, I always tell people, this is embarrassing, but I think it's important to know. In 2004, I voted for Bush. And I say that because I think a lot of people are inclined to believe that I popped out mad radical and was running around talking about abolition from the day I came out the womb. And like, it's just not true. It has been a process of learning information and shifting how I think about all kinds of things, from punishment to economics to community to healing and accountability. Like, it has been, and it will continue to be, whole mind transformation and relationship transformation. I think that's a big part. So really encourage folks to be learning. And I think interrupting criminalization is a great tool. Like, as a platform, they just have so many resources. They have 1 million experiments, which highlights community-based projects, community-based abolitionist projects all over Turtle Island. Some of them mutual aid projects, but like just different ways. Because abolition isn't just prisons and police. It is like, there are so many systems that we have to destroy pieces and build new pieces for. I would also say, like, choose a place that you want to give a contribution to, whatever that might be that aligns with these values. Choose a way that you're down to be a disruptor. And then I feel like one of the things that has enriched my life the most is building with folks inside. Like, what is your relationship to currently incarcerated people? Do you know currently incarcerated people? I mean, it's as simple as being a pen pal with someone and sharing life in that way. It can also be as big as being on folks organizing teams to help get them out. And just really would strongly encourage folks, wherever you are, wherever your organizing relationships are, I guarantee you are in relationship with families who have loved ones incarcerated, and you could be in relationship with folks that are currently inside. And those are really powerful relationships. There are opportunities to buck the system. But more importantly, I think there are ways to show up for people that are sometimes at their lowest point, and also are some of the most incredible organizers and legal scholars I've ever met. Like, jailhouse lawyers are 9 times out of 10 better than any lawyer you're going to find on the outs. So there's just a lot of opportunity to learn and organize movements across walls. And remember that abolition is a borderless thing. It applies. If you're down to abolish this system, you should be down to abolish oppressive systems other places. So grateful that Palestine was lifted up early on, and we really should be interrogating our thoughts and ways to engage with that struggle.
May and Big, if you have anything to share.
Yeah, thank you so much. On the tip of writing people inside, if you don't already have a pen pal, if it's something that you're interested in but don't really know how to get started, our website, I'm pretty sure, has a list of people you can write to. Also, if you're in Duwamish land, I believe that Puget Sound Prisoner Support hosts a monthly letter writing night at Pipsqueak Gallery. So you can look up Puget Sound Prisoner Solidarity, probably on Twitter, they'll post about it. If you just want to like, have a space where you can learn about how do you even write someone? What do I need to know? Who do I write to? Things like that. As far as things that I would love to share and plug, I'll drop the name of one of our comrades who's inside, Bryant Arroyo, who is doing a lot of work for many years from the inside on environmental justice and stopping extractive industries. So just like someone to look up if you want to hear more about people who are incarcerated who are doing environmental justice work. Also, we have a comrade named Jeezy who has been building with FTP for many years now. And I'll just drop a legal fund for them also because they recently caught a case. Sorry, I'll send it with the clickable link in a second, but they've done over 10 years inside right now. They've been in since they were a youth. And they recently caught some conspiracy charges that are complete bogus. They're just based on political repression because this person has been organizing. And they're looking at facing another 30 years inside, which means that they might never get out. And so if that happens, and so we're raising for their legal fund to pay for their lawyers so that they can have a chance of seeing freedom. So please share that. There's also like some of their writings that we might post soon. So yeah, other than that, you can check us out on Instagram, Facebook, on Twitter, we're Fight X Prisons, and on the other ones, just Fight Toxic Prisons. You can email us at fighttoxicprisons@gmail.com. We're always down to connect, and we do post things, especially when there's like climate disasters going on or hunger strikes or actions. So it's a really good way to stay connected with us. Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate all of the different perspectives and really like the nuance that's been brought up. I just want to say I appreciate it and thank you everyone for being here.
I don't really have much to add, but yeah, I mean, keep an eye out for like our disaster response stuff. So like if we get phone zaps up and stuff that y'all can hopefully support and call in because we have been able to force prisons to evacuate in disasters to make sure that people are safe, but it came by these posts going viral and having mass people call in. So please keep an eye out for that. And also, I think be responsible, feel responsible to our communities, feel responsible to each other, because I think that's how we're going to be able to forge through this and be able to really make a change and be able to make it to the other side of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, each and every one of you, for being able to first educate me more alongside these movements, but also for everyone who attended this. I think this is something that is often not really talked about in mainstream movements, and it's such a horror to see that it's still delayed from these conversations. And I just like to say, for my advice is for people just to show up. I mean, showing up is powerful. People take note when you're there at the protests, when you're there at the meetings, when you're there at just anything that happens. I mean, like being able to just show up physically or even mentally on Zoom or whatever, virtually, however you need to communicate with someone, it does showcase and it helps build power in the long term. So I think that is the strongest thing that we have as humanity, as a culture. It's like we know how to bring stories together and people together. So don't forget that. So I'm going to hand it over to Karina and Aki on that end, because we'll do closing remarks on the end.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this has been amazing. Definitely show some love for moderator and panelists in the chat. Throw up your little heart reacts. Feels really good. Yeah, again, just like thank you everyone for joining. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there is a final workshop in this series happening in, I believe, 4.5, 5 weeks, and that'll be on labor and climate justice. You can register at stmp.link/CJ2023. That will also be emailed out, as well as all of the resources that have been dropped in the chat. But yeah, I want to respect everyone's time. Just thank you again for coming. This has been amazing, and have a good rest of your night.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Uh,
Thank you.
So